All right. Hi, everyone. I am Brett Norton with Beyond Clean, and joining me today for our Expert Series Conference Lunch and Learn, as we've coined it, is Mr. Jeff Wertz. He is our vendor management expert for those of you out there who don't know him. And Jeff, I figured for those people that don't know you, would you mind just giving a quick intro and we'll get on with some questions?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. Glad to be here and appreciate everyone tuning in. I'm Jeff Wertz. I'm president at Surgio Health. My background, I was in med device for about five and a half years as independent, just working with an independent distributor, and then also working with one of the big three with Stryker on the orthopedic trauma side as a rep in the hospital in the ASC, and covering cases, running trays around. Running around with my head cut off, getting yelled at, all the above. and really since then, so that's the as it's relevant to the vendor management piece. But then since then, I've really been on the software side, trying to provide solutions that hospitals and manufacturers can utilize to better communicate, create efficiencies and insight between all the different parties involved. And that was those are a lot of the breakdowns that I saw in the space.
Yep. And it's helpful that you were in the space, you saw those challenges. They were very prevalent. I was also on the vendor side, so we both get to put our vendor hats today and explore some of those questions, especially when it relates to your expertise. So wanted to real quickly touch on the elephant in the room, if you want to call it that, because we've seen a lot of posts on LinkedIn lately in regards to vendor trays being left outside, the vendor trays being left on trash cans. And, there is some, ugliness to that, but there's also an explanation, if you will, and thought I would real quickly, or, if it takes a few minutes, that's fine. But I would like to get your opinion on it. And just in terms of just the overall challenges that vendors face, right? It's both sides of the coin, but I just wanted to get your insight because I think that this really does deserve a little bit of exploration.
Yeah. No, thank you. Definitely is not a good look overall, but I think I've made a couple comments in some of those posts. Really, it's a symptom of the overall challenge that I see in the space. And I think it's a lot of it is, poor timing of things, but it is happening. And, where my head goes is there's a whole lot worse that actually probably goes on behind the scenes that's not seen, right at the hospital there. How are those trays stored? How are they managed? And I think it's unfortunately more of a symptom of the kind of how messy the entire process is currently, and also the opportunity that currently exists to improve that process. And I think it's one of those things that the hospitals have an opportunity to put some process in place that could be better managed between the manufacturer and the hospital. But as it stands now, everyone is really trying to do more with less. The manufacturers are trying to move many, many expensive trays. I think it's about an average of around $35,000 per tray of instruments that get made. That varies wildly depending on the specialty. You throw implants in there, it gets exceedingly much more expensive to move those things around for individual procedures. With ASCs coming about, the logistics of all this to make it work for every surgeon at all the different facilities is really challenging. And because it's such a kind of complex system and so many different people are involved with that process, I've written about this in a few different of the expert series that I've done on the background of, the communication gaps and process that the vendors are having to go through and the reps in the field. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. It is really, really human dependent, and the manufacturers don't have a reliable way to just FedEx it in and get it entered into a decontam at the right place, because there's, it's a maze in every single hospital to get that from point A to point B. UPS can't do that. And So unfortunately, it's really dependent on the reps, and they're making do with what they have available. And when you got to move, for a revision case, it's not unheard of to have 30 trays in there. And then when you're trying to move those things around, sometimes the door locks and someone has to set it down to keep the door open because you're going in through the side door that maybe someone made available to you. It's the easiest access point to move that much inventory around. And, I see that as, if it's going to raise attention to the space, then that's an opportunity to improve the overall process. But it really is just a key symptom of a lot of the challenges that are faced by the reps in the hospitals and the manufacturers, everyone involved.
Right. Yeah. And, we're not saying that it's okay to leave trays on the ground, leave them
Right.
on a trash can or in the back of a truck. But there are inherent challenges on both sides. And I've been at hospitals where receiving areas for trays and surgical instruments are really not rep friendly. There's just a place to put them, and the storage rooms aren't necessarily rep friendly either. So there's a process improvement on both sides, training the reps that this is not where you set them, but providing an area where they can deliver their trays, deliver their instruments, have inventory management much more efficient. And so there's a lot of great improvements that can be made. Long road ahead, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And then where do you want them when they are there, and is there room for them there? How are you managing what's currently on the shelf? There's a lot of things that once you start pulling back the onion on this, I always look at what are the hospitals able to put in place at this point? Because I think that the manufacturers would be interested in different models that they are able to kind of plug in and play with that. But at this point, it's still every hospital does the same things completely differently. And that last mile is where the reps are making things work for the surgeon, for the hospital, and the manufacturer. And I think that that's, ultimately the challenge that any hospital faces in any type of a repless model. That's oftentimes what comes up. And I don't see that happening anytime soon based on the dependence that currently exists.
Right. Well, I'm sure we can explore this in detail for over an hour or 2 hours and have all kinds of different points. But I wanted to, you mentioned communication. There is that clinical gap, right? And, we'll get to the communication piece, but talking about clinicians and vendors, why is a clinician buy-in for it's so important for vendor management success?
Yeah. They're the linchpin in all of this, right? They're the common denominator between the manufacturer and the hospital. And what the rep is fulfilling there is acting as that translator, their assistant in that process, is the way that I kind of refer to it. The surgeon has their own language. Anyone that's been in the hospital, that's dealing with the instrumentation, I'm sure that you've felt that. They all have their own nuance associated with it. They want the procedure to go smoothly. Everyone does. Everyone operates based on what the surgeon wants. So, my role as a rep is to make that procedure go as smoothly as possible, and it's understanding what he or she means rather than what they say. And a lot of times, and that is translation. And the current state of things, where structured data currently doesn't exist, that is where the rep is really serving a significant role in making sure that those procedures are running smoothly to not interrupt that kind of surgeon flow. I was talking to a surgeon recently that talks about that, is that, they want to get into the flow state of where they're, the next instrument is coming up when it's supposed to be, that they're thinking about it. They don't have to ask for anything, and they can continue moving through the procedure. And, that's a lot of the rep role is making sure that they're thinking 2 steps ahead, and then also communicating to the hospital and their manufacturer what all that means to each side of that. Because ultimately, surgeon preferences go through the rep at this point. I think that's one of the ultimate challenges that any hospital faces, is you can spend a lot of time trying to improve those surgeon preferences, but as far as the specialties go, where reps are involved, most of it is existing up in the rep's head because they're doing 3 different translations between what the rep says to them, what that actually means to the procedure, the other considerations that you're making for the type of procedure and type of, coming from a trauma side, what other things can pop up that I want to make sure that there's a backup for. Do I bring in an X-fix on top of this one because it's a intra-articular fracture, and we might have to fall back to that. And so a lot of times you're making assumptions on those things, but you're doing it to try to set up the surgeon for the best success possible. And that's where, having that surgeon buy-in to understand what is going on. Sorry to kind of meander through that question, but the surgeon is the one that's making or breaking the procedure. And that communication gap of, hey, I need a XL targeter because it's a larger patient, or I need a specific type of nail because it's a smaller geriatric patient. Those are the things that we're trying to take into consideration so that we're setting them up for success. And when we don't have that communication, those are some of the challenges that we run into when, we need this extra instrumentation at the last minute, and that goes against what the policies are. Surgeons are unaware of what the policy is, but they don't understand what they're in place for, because the ASC that they go to regularly has no problem accepting instruments that are 25 pounds and 24 hours in advance. But your hospital has 48 hours in advance and a 17-pound weight limit. And those all get really confusing for everyone involved. And when the surgeon's unaware of it, it makes it more challenging. And from a rep's perspective, you just go back to the surgeon and say, hey, they're not accepting it. And then we run into the same challenges.
Right. So you're not saying it's just a plug and play solution. It's just like, this is how it happens. And it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the line. It's different styles, different surgeons. They need different instruments. Some have their own preferences when it comes to their, especially ortho cases. They really want this one instrument. So I think
ratchet screwdriver, specific ratchet screwdriver. Yeah. All sorts of those different things. And then they have their own special name for them that you're translating in your head, that at this hospital, they call it this, and it's located over here. And that's, a lot of the kind of the value that is difficult to articulate in a, value analysis meeting, because it's not codified. And we can't say, hey, we saved you 10 minutes of OR time, because we know where everything's located.
Right. Yeah. Very good. So speaking of communication, how can poor communication negatively impact the rep OR dynamic? I mean, it's something that you could say is a simple answer, but there are a lot of negative ways. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it comes down to the preparedness, and I think everyone being on the same page. It's, I make a lot of analogies, and when I'm thinking about this space, as far as the checklist manifesto is a great book about just having the checklists and how they use that in aviation. And I think it makes it's a perfect parallel to this, that everyone is involved and we're all on the same team working in the same direction. And when the surgeons had one conversation with the rep and they haven't had it with the OR team, that creates some conflict, the OR team and the SPD team. And when you don't have that communication, those communication layers, it puts everyone in an awkward position. So it's really, I think that from a rep's role of walking into it, and if you aren't doing anything nefarious where you're bringing in, instruments that aren't approved, that are not approved, that you're trying to skirt the system, is one thing that I think a lot of people can point to. But I think it's also not as prevalent as just the miscommunication of, hey, the rep or the surgeon asked for this, I'm making it available. And, part of it is kind of being in a no man's land of how do I communicate it and what's the direct process for this, because there isn't a clear structure or chain of command that we need to go through on it. And SPD isn't empowered in a lot of locations, and then OR can come down over the top. So it just kind of creates some friction there. And the more you interact with them, the more you work with the surgeons and the ORs, you start to build that camaraderie. But I've certainly been in those instances where I'm not trying to do anything wrong. I'm trying to get things going smoothly. And this is a communication breakdown, and let's start from scratch here, but can certainly, impact the success of those procedures.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, when I was on the vendor side, I certainly I was more SPD oriented, and most of the products that I sold were for SPD use and for the machines and the ultrasonics. But it was very critical for me to make sure that the OR teams understood the use and what I was there for, because there was that communication dynamic that they needed to understand. And so oftentimes when I would go into the hospitals, I would meet with the OR staff, and I would sit down with the OR staff along with SPD staff saying, these are the products that are going to affect the patient eventually. So just having that understanding and that over communication, and just making sure that you're front and center with them. And that's also, as you and I have talked about many times, there's that trust factor. When you communicate and you are there to really give them what they need to understand why you're there, that trust factor is really going to elevate your status as a rep and a vendor. And ultimately, it's going to elevate the status of the patient and the safety in the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And you're getting to how this is impacting the patient and what you're doing is meant to be for the better of it, because I'm going to go with the assumption that that's what most people are doing. Obviously, we're not talking about the bad ones, but I think the more common ones, which is they have the best interest in mind and they're trying to do the best. And I think that's kind of a good default that a lot of, everyone involved with this should try to default to, that they're trying to do the best with what they have. How does this, going into it with that attitude, as opposed to them doing something bad to begin with.
Right. Exactly. All right. What frustrations may reps and clinical staff have towards SPD policies? And I know, we always go into this because there sometimes is that communication gap, as we just talked about, and there's the SPD OR dynamic sometimes that there is that communication issue. So those frustrations, can you highlight some of those?
Yeah, I think I kind of alluded to it earlier also. It's kind of that lack of consistency between facilities. And there's definitely reasons for those. Now that I've been involved with, more intimately with sterile processing and understanding all the complexity of the equipment and all the different factors that come into play there that lead to the variation. There's a reason for it, but I don't think a lot of the clinical teams, may understand that, and it's not communicated to them. So they're, used to going to one facility where, going back to that, they have a 24-hour policy and they allow 25-pound instruments in. And now we're creating this little bottleneck that's creating a challenge that can lead to downstream issues of which trays to open, things like that. And there's just not a clear communication or understanding of how their SPD operates and what policies are in place and the underlying reasons behind those. And again, going back to default that there's a reason for it. But I think that's ultimately the big challenge, is understanding why those reasons or understanding the reasons for those policies and why they were put in place and how they're being measured and managed, or are they just, arbitrary? Because I think that's from a rep perspective, sometimes the feeling that comes across. And I think even sometimes the clinical staff can feel that when the SPD person comes up and says, no, you can't do this. You can't flash this or that. I've been in the middle of those arguments where it's like, I'm just here to do what I can. That instrument fell. I'm going to sit on the side. I don't know all of the requirements of this. And that's where things get heated, and where it's like, feel like this should be a conversation outside of when the patient's on the table, that we have a standard process and expectation of everyone involved of what happens in this scenario, because it does happen. But for whatever reason, it's not a consistent, thing that happens where there's an understanding between OR and SPD and the surgeon, where we can all operate on the same level and just keep moving forward and making progress.
Right. And I like to use the example, the age-old argument of who is in charge of pre-treatment. And there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on with that one, and we could probably go down a big rabbit hole.
I've written on that one too. My firm stance on that, and maybe that there's a, not to go off, I know you didn't ask on this one, but I've always been I'm probably going to catch flack from reps on this side, but I've always been in the opinion I'd rather like manage my own, separate it, get it moved out of the way so that it can be organized, and then it makes the pickup process smoother as well, right? Like the decontamination process and the cleaning and treatment starts up in the OR. I never understood why that's not codified in a standard process in the industry. And it always really irritated me when I go to some facilities where they're like, you're not allowed to do anything or touch anything, just go away. I'm like, okay, well, now you screwed up everything down below because there's going to be blood on it. There's going to be bone in a couple of those cannulas because I know that they didn't, the tech didn't have time to clean them. And now I'm going to have to come back at a random time to try to put them back together and find the different pieces in all the 60 sets that we open.
Yep.
And it's like, sorry, you kind of touched a nerve there with me, taking me back.
Yeah, that's a bit of a soapbox for me because I actually did train OR staff on pre-treatment processes and brought SPD staff into the room so everybody understood the implications of, how it would affect the workflow and ultimately delay cases on the back end. So it's one of those topics that we can talk about all day long. It's definitely a good one.
I think it's similar, like not just to do one more little bit on that. I think it's really interesting. The hospitals that have OR staff and like the techs and nurses spend, a week or some time doing shifts in SPD. And it's, and having been involved with it now on my side, it would have been really valuable from a manufacturer standpoint to train the reps as well in understanding what SPD is going through. Like I was lucky that my, the people that I learned from taught me to respect that department significantly and the role that they're playing and respect that process and not take it for granted. But I think a lot of them, a lot of the younger ones coming up may not get that. And the more that you do understand that entire process, the more empathy and understanding that you have for what they're going through and how they're working through it. I think that leads to better success all the way through and kind of to the communication point that we were discussing just a moment ago.
Yeah. And just across the board, it's a partnership. It's not trying to sell more product or stuff the hospitals with more instruments that they don't need or, chemicals or anything. Bottom line, it's a partnership, and it's making sure that everybody is on the same page, hopefully, in a perfect world. They often never are in healthcare, but we're getting there. And I think that's why we're having these conversations. So hopping over into kind of bridging silos, if you want to call it that, let's talk about SPD. So as an SPD leader, how can you bring clinical teams on board to recognize processes and workflows as it relates to what they're doing and what SPD, is doing?
Yeah, I think so. It's going back to what I was just saying a moment ago. I think incorporating them in the process and doing some job shadowing at the very least, but then also aligning the interests between both of your departments. How are you impacting the procedure? A lot of these go to quality issues with the trays being complete or having issues with them. And letting them understand what you're having to go through in SPD, as well as the OR communicating back to them of what they're both, this comes down to just having conversations. I think it's really interesting how there's different, timeouts that different hospitals do, whether they incorporate SPD or not. That should, in my head, is a no-brainer of having SPD incorporated. I think oftentimes they feel that they're left out and the last people to find out about something until it's too late, and then the surgeon wants a tray within the next 15 minutes. And they're like, you scheduled 4 of them today and we have, two trays. So there's finite resources and there's constraints that can't be skipped. So I think it's aligning those interests and understanding that ultimately what's best for the patient, making sure the procedure goes smoothly for the surgeon, and then lining up KPIs that can be measured. I mean, it's everyone's heard this a million times, but it's true. If you're not measuring anything in that process, it all ends up being feelings and that's the worst way to manage it. So like from SPD person coming up into the OR when everyone's yelling at you and it's like you're reactive, how are we being proactive in addressing this and also understanding, the magnitude of how often these things happen? Because when it happens, you don't want it to happen one time, but when it does happen, it really exacerbates things. But if you can go in and say, hey, this isn't a regular thing, this is what we're doing to mitigate it, and how we're measuring it over time. Those are some of the basics that need to be in place everywhere. And then how the reps impact that also, what is directly happening as a result of that. If you aren't measuring any of those pieces, it just becomes a whole lot of people complaining, and it doesn't allow much room for proactive management conversation and that kind of empathy that's required of, they are doing the right things. We understand them, and this is how we know that they're doing it. So, we'll work through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you can always bring sports into that in terms of an analogy and team. When people are yelling at each other and on your back and complaining about the job you're not doing something right. It's just not going to be beneficial for anybody involved. It's going to break down from the beginning. Frustrations are going to build up, and then there's going to be animosity and all kinds of things. So you just, you really want to have those good conversations in terms of this is a process improvement, and this is how we can recognize fault and we can just move forward. But it's certainly,
I think everyone inherently understands those things. It's taking the time and having the discipline to put an actual structure in place and follow through on it. And what is the system that you're falling back to? I think I've talked a lot about that in recent conversations. Is a lot of these things come up when something goes wrong, and then they just have a goal of just let's make sure that we don't have this happen again. That doesn't really resolve the underlying challenge. What are we putting in place as a system that is reliable, that we can fall down to? The saying, or you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of the systems that are in place. And a lot of this space is really tribal knowledge and inconsistent processes, some for good reasons, some just because people don't take the time and put a disciplined system in place.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And, that kind of turns this conversation to data. Data is a good way to measure process improvement. It's a good way to find issues in the pipeline and to basically say this isn't working. We've measured it. So what data should you gather to demonstrate vendor issues?
Yeah. So I got an article around this also that we can try to point to as well, but anything. I mean, the logbook that is at most places, what purpose does this serve? You're supposed to have one there, but is any of that data reliable? And do you go back to that when there's lost, broken instruments? Do you go back to it when you're trying to prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt that I really did drop it off at that time because I wrote it down? So it's going to be specific, like most solutions are. What is important to your hospital? What is important to your surgeons? What are the challenges that you're facing? And if you want to address it, you need to start from somewhere and actually start measuring it. So it can be as simple as taking that logbook that you already have and counting up the number of sets that are coming through and illustrating how big of a challenge this is, and looking at the times. What are you doing with that data that currently exists that does take some time to aggregate it and put that into practice? But if it is a bottleneck for you, if it's creating productivity issues for you, then how are you communicating that to leadership that it's creating a downstream effect? I think that there's a lot of, it's easy to sit by and complain, but how do you want to address it? And I think hospital leaders are looking for people that want to take those things on and can run with it, because I think the biggest challenge in the space for SPD is that they have a challenge in communicating everything that's going on. And if you can start to bridge that gap with some actual data around it, no one's going to argue. Right? Like, okay, we've taken these steps in place. we would like some more assistance in this, and these are the reasons for it. You can justify it from when you're selling into the C-suite, you want to be talking, cost savings, patient safety, and efficiencies, and all those SPD, it checks every single one of those boxes, and yet it's a department that's constantly struggling for funding because it's not necessarily a cost center, because they haven't dug in and understood all of the different levers that can be pulled to address all of those different pieces. And
Right.
if you don't start somewhere, you're not going to get anything.
Yep. No, very, very true. Well, we're getting short on time here, Jeff. I think we could probably go for a full hour. But wanted to talk about, speaking on the data piece, how does data open clinicians' eyes to the overall vendor impact on the facility, on the OR, on the surgeon, on the patient? I think that's probably the end game is the patient, or it is the end game, not probably. Yep. It is.
Right.
So can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to them. A lot of times the surgeon didn't know what I was all bringing in. I think that's kind of a misnomer between the hospitals and the surgeons and the reps in general. Like when, we have a lot of conversations with hospitals saying we want to start off with, we'll manage the communication to the reps and we'll just talk to the surgeons and ask them what trays are needed. They don't know, most of the time, they don't know what equipment is needed. They know what they want to implant, but that's the role of the rep, is to make sure that all the tools are there for them to be able to implant what they're expecting to implant. And frankly, I don't see why they have to know all of those different pieces. That's for what the manufacturer needs to be able to provide in a efficient way. So if you can take any of that data, I look at that as being the first step to any of these projects. When you start looking at, consignment, how many trays do you have consigned so that you're prepared for it? I think that's a giant gap in, from a compliance standpoint, from a efficiency standpoint, and storage standpoint. How many trays do you currently have from all of your vendors? Do you have the consignment agreements? If those trays go missing and the new rep shows up and says, hey, our data shows that everything was consigned here and it's $1 million worth of trays with implants, that becomes a finger pointing argument. And then if you want to get into actually understanding when does it make sense for loaners or not, and then how many are an appropriate amount for these procedures. There's a lot of discussion on, reducing the number of sets and consolidating sets. And that's a really tall task for any organization to accomplish, because you're trying to manage multiple surgeons, their preferences on things that have zero structured data around it, meaning what trays are actually used for each procedure. And a lot of times they don't even know how many trays came in for the procedure or even put on a case card for a procedure. And these are complex challenges in bringing any of that data to the surgeon and saying, hey, you're bringing X amount of trays over what our average is. What's the reason for this? Is there a way that we can reduce it? Is it a communication issue, kind of what we discussed earlier? Or is it a specific procedure? Just getting a better understanding of it when it makes sense to begin reducing it. All of this takes, baby steps to moving in that direction. And I think a lot of times people set a really high goal of, we want to just consolidate all the sets. Start off with how many sets are actually being used and brought in for a specific procedure, because you can actually work on the same side of the table as the vendors. They don't want to reset 15 trays every single time, but that was the way the surgeon did it at fellowship, or that's the way that they've been used to doing it. But when you bring data to the table, it eliminates some of those misnomers that they may have, or you better understand it, and then you can start having a conversation on how do we begin consolidating those. But You got to start from square one, and kind of build it out into a crawl, walk, run.
Yeah, and not just supply trays on the assumption that you might use an instrument, and that's how these inventory levels are just getting astronomical, as you mentioned. And with the data piece, if you've got a specific instrument that's always in the tray, or maybe 3 or 4 instruments that the surgeon is just not using, and you've got that data to support it, then you can start pulling it out. You can start
Correct.
not, and then it's less reprocessing, it's less on the vendors, it's less on just the OR staff to get everything set up and ready for the surgeon. So data,
That surgeon might not know that they're
right?
processing an entire tray just for that one item. And
Yep.
it's, these are the things that are lost in translation, that until you bring some data to the table and understand it and have the vendors, abiding by that process, because you have a disciplined process in place that makes sense for them to be able to utilize it. You don't get to that level of detail, but I think everyone is looking for things to be smoother. And when you bring that to the surgeon and have an open, honest discussion with them, especially in the ASCs today, I see that as being a great, ground zero for innovation and in doing some of these things differently, because there's less, bureaucracy and red tape in that space to build out. And there's smaller teams where everyone's wearing multiple hats. So I think it's a great opportunity to innovate in that space.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, let's get through one more question to conclude this discussion. I'd love to keep going, but so if you had one takeaway for SPD leaders on collaborating with OR teams, what would that be? You can say more than one if because there probably are a few different, items.
Yeah. So from a vendor perspective to collaborate in, it really kind of comes down to, from where I would be sitting, is making sure that they're on board with the policies that they have in place and understanding the rationale behind what is in place, because it puts everybody in a tough spot when I show up with the trays that I've been communicated, at the last moment, assuming the best of everyone in the scenario, where I scrambled and drove all over town to collect all these instruments, and then SPD says no, and then I'm fighting between the OR and the surgeon and SPD to get those things put in place. I think that ultimately getting that communication down would be the number one thing from a vendor perspective, is having everyone aligned on what that process is. I always think back to the VA has a very clear-cut process and policy that everyone understands, from the surgeon all the way through to SPD. If those trays aren't brought in that, I think it's 72 hours now, and it's been a while since I've done it, but there's a very clear-cut expectation on what has to be delivered, how it has to be delivered, and if it doesn't get in by that time with all those things, the case is canceled and it's out of the rep's hands. I think a lot of times there's finger pointing of, you could do this, but you aren't, because of an arbitrary thing that we don't understand. And I think the more that there's alignment of, hey, this is how we do things, and this is for this reason, because on the big picture of things, it's going to help everything run more smoothly. There's going to be instances where this is going to create a problem where we're going to have to work through and work to improve. But if we haven't notified the rep at this time in this process that we set an expectation for, where they've communicated back and then they've gone through these steps, then we can all be on the same page.
Yeah. Great points. And I will say that at being on the surgery table a number of times myself, my biggest fear would be to have surgery canceled, because there's all of that prep and anxiety, the night before, the lack of sleep, the lack of food, and you just want to get it over with. And so just putting the patient in a situation where a case gets canceled, you just don't want that to be happening. So,
yeah. And I think just to add one more small piece onto that is the accountability piece of everyone's role in the process. That's, I think, just in general, in a lot of different spaces, taking accountability goes a long ways for everyone in that process of, I was notified late, but this happened and then this happened and I didn't, it was a little out of my control. Here's how I can manage it next time. Can build a lot more trust moving forward, and actually working towards a better solution. So I think that's another part of that, between the OR and SPD, as well as, I could have communicated, I'll take some culpability in what happened, from when I found out about it at this point. But I think giving everyone that kind of grace of, of understanding where they're coming from, and then taking that accountability, personally. That's gone a long ways for me when I've, unfortunately screwed up in the past and delivered something at the wrong location. Those are things that stuck with me, but I went a lot further for that relationship with that facility because I said, I fully own this. It was my screw up. I deeply apologize to anyone. And, that built a better rapport for me for that hospital because they knew he's not going to give me the runaround when something is going on. And I think that goes a long ways with a lot of people anymore.
Right. All right, my friend. Well, I think we're going to have to stop there. Great points. Always good to see you. And
Always.
A lot of good takeaways in terms of how we can improve communication across all spectrums of patient care. And I think we can probably keep going with this conversation, Jeff. And so, yeah, we thank you,
Looking
man.
forward to it. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Jeff Wertz. If you have any questions for him, please feel free to reach out via LinkedIn. He's always available. And as always, keep fighting dirty. I'm Brett Norton with Beyond Clean, and we'll see you soon.